In that period, I've identified 243 casualties. They consist of National Army, who would be the predominantly large number. There's over 80 of those. There's over 60 anti-treaty, and the remainder, you have 4 Gardaí, and you have the rest are civilians. The ages range from a 7-year-old girl killed in Tipperary town when the anti-treaty side were pulling out of the town. A bullet went into the kitchen of the house and she was killed. We don't know who fired it. And the eldest I've identified was a 69-year-old woman shot and feathered on a Sunday evening. She was shot by a National Army sentry for failing to halt. And you have all categories and ages in between.
And you're doing a biography on every person.
And to me, these were living people. They deserve to be remembered. They're a lot more than just statistics on a page. They were living, eating, breathing, walking people. There were someone's children, there were someone's father, someone's mother, someone's brother. And as far as I'm concerned, they have to be remembered. We have to try and tell as much of their story as we can. Bring them out of the shadows, let people see who they were. And I think when people understand who the people that died were, I think it'll take an awful lot of the division out of things, because these were all ordinary men and women that walked the streets. They were young farmers' sons or townsmen looking for, trying to scrape an existence, joining the army, which gave them some way of employment at the time. I mean, remember after the War of Independence, the country was in a pretty bad state. It was very hard to earn a living, and 5 shillings a week that you were being promised in the National Army, plus, we'll say, your meals all found, a roof over your head, a uniform to wear, that was a huge attraction to an awful lot of people. And that was one of the main reasons. On the opposite side then, you had people that firmly believed that they had taken an oath to uphold the Republic, and that nothing could release them from that oath. And they were willing to die in search for that Republic that they believed in. And then on top of that, you had just young guys that thought that this was all great excitement, as any young people think, and never thinking of the consequences of war and the horrible violence and misery of war. They just joined in on either or other side, and unfortunately many of them died, left in blood on the Irish Tipperary countryside.
And were most of the people were the Tipperary men?
No, there's those that died in Tipperary. There's a huge geographical spread. You've Dublin, you've Kerry, you've Wexford, Kilkenny, Cork, Limerick. You've people from all over, basically. Particularly in the National Army, the civilians tended to be all Tipperary people, and the Gardaí then came from all over. There's a fantastic man, Sean Kenny. He lives near Duncarn there, between Moneygall and Rossgrey, and Sean has fantastic stories of that period. And Sean related a story to me that was related directly by one of the men involved to him. 2 men employed as labourers on the estate at Lawton. On Saturday morning in, I think, late August 1922, they were working away cutting timber. It's a spilling wet, dirty Saturday, and some stage during the morning anyway, they took a break, and one of them coming out to work that morning, he picked up the Nina Guardian in the local shop, and as they were having their break, they were looking at the paper, and saw this ad in it for soldiers wanted for the National Army. Neither of the men had ever fired a gun in their life. They had no experience of soldiering. They hadn't even been part of the volunteers or anything like that, so they had absolutely no experience. But the 5 shillings a week was an awful lot more than they were getting. And one of them said to the other, "We're right Egypts," he said, "sitting here," he said, "getting wet." He said, "We could be above in Portlaoise," he said, "with fine, clean uniforms and a roof over our head and food in our stomachs." And he said, and the two of them just dropped the tools where they were, got up on their bicycles and cycled into Moneygall. There was a bus due sometime around midday heading to Dublin, and they left their bicycles at the local post office and told the postmistress that there'd be someone from home to pick up the bicycles. They boarded the midday bus for Portlaoise and got to Portlaoise sometime around 2:30, went into the barracks and joined up, and at 4:30 that afternoon they were in the back of a Crossley tender with a Lee Enfield rifle between their knees, and they were going out on a patrol. So that gives you an example of, we'll say, what was attracting people into the National Army, the kind of people that were being forced by pure economic circumstances to go into the army, and the lack of training, which led to an awful lot of their deaths. There's a huge portion of those 89 National Army men that I've identified that either shot themselves accidentally or were shot by comrades.
As I said, I wrote a book on the Civil War in the county, but the focus is obviously the south of the county, where most of the activity. And if you look at the 3 brigades, which again Tipperary was divided into, the one in the north was in a different division, and the focus there was towards Laois and Offaly, and they went Free State. The Republican element did launch themselves into a kind of a guerrilla warfare, and they launched ambushes and so on, but effectively, and you had very much a divided command, because some went one way and some went the other way, and some just stood on the sidelines and didn't go anyway. And similarly in the south of the county, which was in the 2nd division, which was, the 2nd Brigade and the 3rd Brigade, mid-Tipperary, South Tipperary were together. But again, all the running was made by the south, because the chap who was in charge of the mid-Tipperary was Jim Lee from Thurles. And he was very active and very famous during the War of Independence. He worked they had a family, I think, had a pub in the square in Thurles. But during the Civil War, much less so, and he kind of got into trouble with the more hardline Republicans in that they failed. Templemore is not very far from Thurles, and Templemore obviously has a huge military complex, the Garda Training College now. So they wanted that either captured or burned, preferably, I suppose, burned, and Leahy is the man who was in charge, and again, it's a complicated story, but to give the short version, it wasn't burned, for which he got a lot of stick. But of course, the way I look at it today, if you were to ask anybody in Templemore, well, would you have preferred your barracks to have been burned? I think they would have probably said no. So in that respect, time changes perspective. So in those 2 brigades, there was a lot of division of opinion. Some leaders went one way, some went the other way. 3rd Tipperary Brigade, totally different. The leadership there was rock solid, anti-treaty. The treaty, the date most people will know, signed on the 6th of December. By the 10th, O'Malley and Lynch, who's leading the 1st Division, Cork, Kerry, those areas, they're against the treaty. In other words, there's clearly no meetings of men to discuss the ins and outs of the treaty and will we or won't we, and there's an edict from on high. And so vehement was the 3rd Brigade in its opposition to the treaty that some of the people, the leaders in the 3rd Brigade, wanted the delegates when they came back from London having signed, to be arrested for treachery. Cathal Brugha, who was technically in charge of the army, Collins, of course, might have had a different view. It's one of the reasons why they loathed each other. He thought maybe that was a push too far, but it's an indication of the kind of certainty and the vehemence that there was in the south, and even the political representation in South Tipperary. The TD from the 1918 election for the Tipperary town area, which was the most Republican area, was P.J. Maloney, who in his private professional life was a pharmacist in Tipperary. But his sons were very active in the War of Independence, and one of them subsequently in the Civil War. He was kind of number 2 nationally in the anti-treaty side. But another son was killed towards the end of the War of Independence, which is 1921, and the treaty is 1921. And I've always understood, I mean, when it came to the vote on the treaty, P.J. Maloney, the TD, obviously voted against the treaty. Now, that I absolutely understand, because only months before, his son had been killed with a man from Monaghan, Jim Duffy. They'd actually been betrayed, but that's a kind of another. So it made the killing of them kind of all the worse, because, again, I'm kind of going off into tangents a little, but that they'd had a suspected spy whom they had wanted to execute, which was not that unusual. And they had to get permission from on high, and on high said, no, there isn't enough evidence, and they let him go. And clearly they probably should have executed him, because they were out at their home place and they would have been paying very periodic visits, and lo and behold, soldiers and the TANs and the police were there, and the two of them were killed. But my point is, that was only a few months before the vote. Now, that Maloney chap, Paddy Maloney, didn't die for Home Rule. He didn't die for Dominion status. What he died for was the Republic. And it's always intriguing if you be semantically correct about it. It's never a republic, which, you know, politically kind of is what we're talking about. It's just a form of government. It's the Republic, which kind of elevates it to something kind of sacred. And so there's no way that somebody like P.J. Maloney, you know, could have. So I absolutely understand that. It's much more difficult to understand the absolute denial of any kind of democracy, because if you look at all the institutions within the county, whether it's town governments, whether it's because there are 2 county councils in the north and the south, whether it's Sinn Féin clubs, whether it's Board of Guardians, any kind of collective body, they all, after the vote on the treaty in the Dáil, so we're talking kind of into January 1922, with virtually no exception, and they all supported the treaty. The 3 main newspapers in Tipperary, the Nenagh Guardian for the north, the Tipperary Star kind of for mid, the Nationalist for the south, they were all, of course, in favour of the treaty. So any kind of, and of course the church, well, when I say the church, the institutional church, but you did have individual priests, famously in Tipperary, a priest called Matt Ryan, known as the General from his activity during the Land War. He was a parish priest in Dundrum. But he was a kind of a maverick. So you did have individual, but on the whole, the church, certainly institutionally, and even somebody in North Tipperary, the bishop there had been very supportive of Sinn Féin, but he was pro-treaty. So whatever way you want to look, the people wanted the treaty. And that's the problem then, of course, that the people didn't have the guns. So it didn't really matter whatever division of opinion there was between politicians. It was the IRA. So the crucial issue was, how are they going to go?
I'm Martin Mansergh. I'm from a couple of miles north of Tip Town, where my family, or at any rate ancestors of different names, have lived for 300 years or more. I was born across the water. My father was brought up in Tipperary and in Ireland, but he had an academic career. He was a history professor. So I was born the other side of the water, but wider family was back here in Tipperary. And I suppose I was an advisor to 3 Taoiseach for 21 years. A lot of it to do with Northern Ireland, but not exclusively so. And I worked with Haughey, then Reynolds, then Bertie Ahern, and I was a back channel to the Republican movement in the late 80s, early 90s. Now it got a reasonably intensive engagement. It was mainly with Martin McGuinness, 92 to 94. And I was part of the negotiating team for both the Downing Street Declaration and the Good Friday Agreement, and then the aftermath of it. I mean, the peace process consisted of 3 phases. Getting to ceasefires, that took about 6 years. Then trying to negotiate an agreement that would underpin those ceasefires. And then, of course, the task which lasted till 2010, and some people would argue is still going on, implementing what was agreed, because there are plenty of examples of peace agreements that are not implemented, and the peace may or may not survive. I'll leave you one other anecdote. Father Reid of the Redemptorists, with whom I dealt with, I can tell you actually when I was a young Protestant, I could never have imagined that I would spend the most important part of my working life in secluded Redemptorist monasteries. That's one of the ironies of history. But Father Reid used to answer if he was asked, who do I represent? And his answer was, the next person who's going to get shot. And it's quite a strong and effective answer. But hopefully, you see, I think one of the problems with commemoration is you get yourself back into the time, whether it's 1916 or 21, 22, and so on, and you can almost imagine yourself is that nothing has really changed. But actually a huge amount has changed, and some of it has changed because of the lessons on various different sides that people have learned, and that they've moved on. You could say the Civil War was a painful learning experience.